If someone had told me a year ago that I'd find everything I was running from in a snowstorm, I would have laughed. A dry, bitter sound with no humor in it. Back then, my life was a fortress of solitude, each wall built from routine and emotional distance. I'd leased a small, isolated cabin in the mountains, a place where the silence was so profound it had a physical weight. It was exactly what I wanted. A place to write, a place to forget, a place to be utterly, completely alone. My world was the predictable cycle of sunrise, lukewarm coffee, the blinking cursor on a blank page, and the eventual surrender to a dreamless sleep. And then there was Cole. He wasn't part of the plan. He was the property's caretaker, a local man who handled everything from plumbing to chopping wood for the handful of remote rentals scattered across the mountainside. From my window, I watched him. It was a detached, anthropological sort of observation at first. He moved with an economy of motion that was both efficient and mesmerizing. A force of nature in faded denim and a worn canvas jacket. He was tall, broad-shouldered, a stark silhouette against the backdrop of pine and sky. He rarely spoke. When he did, his voice was a low rumble, practical and clipped. He'd show up once a week to drop off firewood, his gaze sweeping over the cabin, checking for problems, but never quite landing on me. It felt intentional. He saw the leaking gutter, the loose porch step, the fraying screen door. He did not see me. To me, he was arrogance carved from granite. His silence felt like a judgment. His competence, a quiet mockery of my own fumbling attempts at self-sufficiency. I, who wrestled with words for a living, couldn't even manage to fix a dripping faucet. Cole could probably build a whole house with his bare hands and a stern look. The distance between us wasn't just the stretch of gravel driveway. It was a chasm of different worlds. He was the earth, solid and real. I was just a ghost haunting a keyboard. My longing was a secret shame, a warmth that bloomed in my chest whenever I saw his truck rattling up the road. It was ridiculous, an absurd, schoolboy crush on a man who probably didn't even know my name. A man who represented everything I wasn't. Capable, confident, grounded. He was a physical fact. I was a theoretical concept. And so I kept my distance, hiding behind the glass of my window, cataloging the details of a life I could only observe. The first flakes began falling on a Tuesday. They were soft, apologetic things at first, drifting down from a sky the color of old pewter. The weather report had promised a dusting, nothing more. A picturesque winter scene to inspire a few paragraphs. I made another pot of coffee, wrapped myself in a blanket, and settled into work, feeling smugly cozy. By noon, the dusting had become a thick, swirling curtain. The world outside my window dissolved into a churning whiteness. The wind began to howl, a low, mournful sound that rattled the window panes. This was no dusting. This was a siege. My smugness curdled into a familiar, low-grade anxiety. The power flickered once, twice, then died with a sad, definitive click. The hum of the refrigerator, the glow of my laptop screen, the quiet buzz of electricity, all gone. The silence that rushed in to fill the void was different. It wasn't the peaceful, contemplative quiet I usually cherished. This was an aggressive, predatory silence, heavy with the threat of the storm. And then came the crack. A sound like the sky splitting open, followed by a deafening thud that shook the entire cabin. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic, trapped bird. I crept to the window, peering through the maelstrom. A massive pine branch, heavy with snow, had snapped and fallen against the side of the house, right where the chimney ran. A puff of smoke billowed back into the room from the fireplace. The flue was blocked. The cabin's only source of heat was now actively trying to suffocate me. Panic, cold and sharp, sank its teeth into me. I had no cell service. The landline was dead. The road was impassable. I was trapped. My desperation must have sent out some kind of signal into the ether, because through the blinding snow, I saw it. The slow, determined crawl of headlights. Cole's old, beaten-up truck fighting its way up the mountain. He was checking on the properties. On me. A wave of relief, so powerful it made my knees weak, washed over me, followed immediately by a hot flush of shame. The self-sufficient writer, defeated by a bit of weather. He was at my door minutes later, his form immense against the swirling white. Snow clung to his hair and shoulders. His face was chapped red by the wind, but his eyes were calm, assessing the situation before I even opened my mouth. "Power's out everywhere," he said. "No greeting. Just a fact. You all right in here?" "The chimney," I managed, my voice sounding thin and useless. "A branch fell. It's blocked," he nodded once, his gaze already moving past me, toward the smoking fireplace. He stepped inside, bringing the cold and the smell of pine and winter with him. He was a mountain in my small, suddenly fragile house. And just like that, the storm wasn't just outside anymore. It was in here with me, and the world had shrunk to the size of this one room. He got to work immediately. No wasted words, no small talk. He moved with that same focused intensity I'd watched from my window, but now it was happening 3 feet away from me. The proximity was unnerving. I could see the fine lines around his eyes, the way his dark hair curled slightly at his collar where the snow had melted. I could smell the faint, clean scent of sawdust and cold air that clung to his jacket. I tried to help, fetching tools he didn't need, holding a flashlight that only seemed to get in his way. I felt like a child, clumsy and superfluous in my own home. He was on the roof for what felt like an eternity, a dark shape against the raging white, fighting the wind to clear the debris. When he came back inside, he was covered in snow, his breathing coming in ragged puffs of condensation. He got the fire going again, a clean, strong draft pulling the smoke up and away. The relief was immediate, a wave of warmth that was more than just physical. "You're lucky," he said, staring into the flames. "Could have been a lot worse." He stood to leave, and a fresh spike of panic hit me. The thought of being alone again in the roaring dark was unbearable. "The road," I blurted out. "You can't possibly drive in this. It's not safe." He looked out the window, his expression unreadable. The snow was coming down so thick it was like the world had been erased. He was silent for a long moment. My heart pounded a frantic rhythm against the roar of the wind. "Please stay. Please don't go." "Guess not," he said, his voice flat. He shrugged off his heavy jacket and hung it on the hook by the door. The simple, domestic act felt momentous, a treaty signed between 2 warring nations. He was staying, trapped, with me. The first few hours were a masterclass in awkward silence. We existed in separate orbits within the small cabin. He sat in the worn armchair by the fire, staring into the flames, while I retreated to the kitchen, pretending to be busy with things that didn't require electricity. I made a list of my king goods. I organized my tea bags. I counted the silverware. Anything to avoid the gravitational pull of the man in the other room. Every sound was amplified. The sigh of the wind, the crackle of the logs in the hearth, the creak of the floorboards when one of us shifted our weight. The silence between us was a living thing, a third presence in the room, and it was suffocating. My internal monologue was a relentless, screaming chaos of anxiety. What do I say? What does he think? Does he resent being stuck here? Does he hate me? I could feel his presence like a low hum against my skin. Even with my back to him, I was aware of every small movement he made, the way he stretched his legs out toward the fire, the sound of his hand rubbing against the rough denim of his jeans. I started to notice things I couldn't see from my window. There was a long, thin scar that ran from his right temple into his hairline, pale against his skin. His hands, which I'd always seen as just large and capable, were a roadmap of his life. Calloused and nicked, with a faint stain of what might have been wood varnish under his fingernails. There was a deep weariness in the set of his shoulders, a slight slump that wasn't there when he was working. The man I had built up in my head, this stoic, unflappable monolith, was just a man. A tired man, trapped in a storm. I finally forced myself to break the silence. "I have some stew," I offer, my voice startlingly loud. "Canned. But it's food." He turned his head slowly, his eyes catching the firelight. For the first time, he looked directly at me. Really looked. His gaze was intense, and I felt a jolt, a current running straight through me. "Okay," he said. "Just that one word." We ate sitting on the floor by the hearth, using camping plates because it felt appropriate somehow. The stew was bland, but the warmth was welcome. We didn't talk while we ate. But it was a different kind of silence now. A shared silence, built around the small ritual of a meal. Less of a void, more of a space. He was setting his empty plate aside when it happened. He shifted his weight, and his knee brushed against mine. It was nothing, a fleeting, accidental contact. But for me, it was everything. A surge of heat, sharp and electric, shot up my leg and spread through my entire body. My breath hitched, my stomach filled with a swarm of frantic bees. It was the first time we had touched. I froze, every muscle in my body tensed, waiting for him to pull away, to recoil. But he didn't. He left his knee right there, a point of solid, undeniable pressure against mine. My mind went blank. All the noise, all the anxiety just stopped. There was only the roar of the fire, the howl of the wind, and the overwhelming, terrifying, wonderful fact of his leg pressed against mine. I didn't dare to breathe. I didn't dare to move. I was certain he could hear my heart, which was no longer a bird but a sledgehammer, trying to break its way out of my chest. The moment stretched into an eternity. He didn't acknowledge it. He just kept staring into the fire, his expression unchanged. Was it possible he hadn't even noticed? No. The contact was too deliberate, too sustained. He knew. He had to know. And he wasn't moving away. Then something shifted. He brought up a small generator from his truck before the worst of the storm hit. But it had sputtered out an hour ago, leaving us with only the fire and a couple of emergency candles. The light was flickering, dancing across the walls, casting our shadows long and distorted. The cold was beginning to seep back into the room, a tangible presence pressing against the windows. "The fire's dying down," I said, my voice barely a whisper. My throat was tight. He looked at the hearth. "Need more logs." The wood he'd brought in was damp from the snow. It would smoke and smolder, but it wouldn't catch properly. We needed dry kindling, and the small pile I had was almost gone. My mind, a useless repository of historical fact from the novel I was failing to write, dredged up a detail about long-burning fires, about how pioneers would arrange the logs in a specific way, a self-feeding structure that could last for hours. "Wait," I said, surprising myself. I know a way." To make it last, Cole looked at me, a flicker of something. Skepticism? Curiosity? In his eyes. For the first time all night, the dynamic tilted. Here was one small thing, one tiny area of expertise in this crisis that was mine. He, the master of all things practical, was out of his element. I, the man of books and theory, had a piece of practical knowledge. I explained it to him, my words clumsy at first, then gaining confidence as I remembered the diagrams from my research. The way to build the base, how to place the larger logs on top to burn down slowly. He listened. He didn't interrupt or scoff. He just watched me, his head tilted slightly. We worked together. He would hand me the logs, and I would place them, my fingers brushing against his as I took them. Each touch was a small explosion on my skin. The air between us was thick with unspoken things. The fire became our singular focus, a collaborative project in the heart of the storm. And it worked. The flames caught, licking up the sides of the carefully constructed pyre, and settled into a steady, radiant burn. A deep, satisfying warmth began to push back the cold. I stood up, dusting the bark from my hands, a ridiculous surge of pride swelling in my chest. "Not bad," Cole said, his voice low. It wasn't exactly a compliment, but from him, it felt like a standing ovation. The playing field had leveled just slightly. I wasn't just the helpless tenant anymore. I was a partner, an equal, at least in this one small moment. I felt emboldened. "I have a bottle of whiskey," I said. "The good stuff. I think this counts as an emergency." A small smile touched the corner of his mouth. It was the first time I had ever seen him smile. It transformed his entire face, softening the hard lines and making him look younger, more approachable. It made him look devastatingly handsome. My heart did a painful little flip. We sat back down by the fire, our knees almost touching again, and passed the bottle back and forth. We didn't use glasses. It felt more honest that way. The whiskey was a thread of liquid fire, chasing away the last of the chill and loosening the knots of tension in my shoulders. The cabin was our entire universe, a small, fire-lit island in a sea of howling white. The storm had created a bubble of intimacy, forcing a proximity that would have been unthinkable just that morning. Outside, the world was being torn apart. Inside, something was being quietly, terrifyingly built. The whiskey worked its magic. The silence returned, but it was comfortable now, companionable. We watched the flames dance, each lost in our own thoughts, yet deeply aware of the other's presence. I felt a strange sense of peace settle over me. The anxiety was gone, replaced by a quiet hum of anticipation. It was Cole who spoke first, his voice rough with emotion. Sometimes I hate the quiet up here. The words hung in the air between us, raw and unexpected. It was a confession, a crack in the granite facade. I looked at him, really looked at him, and saw past the capable caretaker. I saw a man who was lonely. I thought that was the point, I said softly. The peace and quiet. He took a long swallow from the bottle before answering, his eyes fixed on the fire. It was, at first, he hesitated, and I could tell he was wrestling with himself, deciding what to say, what to reveal. I came here after things fell apart back home. Thought if I couldn't hear anyone else, I wouldn't have to hear myself. Either he gave a short, humorless laugh. Doesn't work that way. The quiet just makes the noise in your own head louder. His vulnerability was a physical blow. It knocked the air out of my lungs. This man, who I had painted as so self-assured, so complete, was just as broken as I was. He was hiding too. I know what you mean, I said, the admission costing me more than he could ever know. I came here to disappear. I thought if I could just be completely alone, I wouldn't have to pretend anymore. Pretend to be normal, functional, my own confession, whispered into the firelight. I felt stripped bare, my fortress walls crumbling to dust. He turned his head and looked at me. His gaze was so direct, so unguarded, it felt like he was seeing straight through my skin, into the terrified, lonely core of me. The space between us crackled. The air grew thick, heavy with everything we weren't saying. You don't seem like you're pretending, he said, his voice a low murmur. His words were a key, unlocking something deep inside me. A validation I didn't even know I was starving for. The world narrowed to the few inches between us. I could see the flicker of the fire reflected in his dark eyes. I could feel the heat radiating from his body. My own body was humming, a string pulled taut. He was so close. All I had to do was lean forward. I don't know who moved first. Maybe we both did. It wasn't a conscious decision. It was an inevitability, a gravitational pull that had been building since he first stepped through my door. His lips met mine. It was slow, hesitant, a question. His lips were chapped from the cold, but soft. The faint taste of whiskey and wood smoke was on his breath. One of his large, calloused hands came up to cup my jaw, his thumbs stroking gently against my skin. The touch was electric, grounding. It sent a tremor through my entire body. This wasn't a kiss of frantic passion. It was a kiss of profound, staggering honesty. It was two lonely people finding a moment of shelter in each other. It was the silence between us finally breaking, not with words, but with a connection so deep it left me breathless. I kissed him back, pouring all my secret, hopeless longing into it. All the observations from my window, all the unspoken fears, all the desperate yearning for a touch, a connection, a single moment of being truly seen. His hand moved from my jaw to the back of my neck, his fingers tangling in my hair, pulling me closer. The kiss deepened, becoming more confident, more certain. It was a discovery, a mapping of new territory. It was the most real thing I had ever felt in my entire life. When we finally broke apart, we were both breathless. We rested our foreheads together, the firelight painting our faces in shifting shades of orange and gold. Neither of us spoke. There were no words for what had just happened. In the quiet of the storm, in the heart of the enforced solitude, I had found the one thing I had convinced myself I could never have. And I was terrified. I woke to silence, a different kind of silence, not the howling of the storm or the companionable quiet of the night before. This was the flat, dead silence of a world muffled by a thick blanket of new snow. The fire had burned down to glowing embers, and the cabin was cold. And I was alone. Cole was gone. His jacket was missing from a hook by the door. His boots were gone. The only evidence he had been there at all was the empty whiskey bottle and the second plate by the sink. Panic, cold and suffocating, wrapped itself around my chest. I scrambled out from under the pile of blankets on the sofa, my heart hammering against my ribs. I looked out the window. The storm had passed. The sky was a brilliant, painful blue, and the sun glared off a pristine, unbroken landscape of white. And in the distance, I could see them. A set of footprints leading away from my cabin, toward the main road. He had left. He had woken up in the cold light of day and walked away. My mind, my own worst enemy, began its vicious assault. It was a mistake, a moment of weakness. He regrets it. The storm, the whiskey, the loneliness, it was a fluke, an aberration. And now that the sun is out, he sees his mistake. He sees you. And he ran. The thought was a physical blow. I sank onto the floor, the cold would seeping through my clothes. The intimacy of the previous night felt like a fever dream. The confession, the kiss. Had I imagined it all? Had I projected my own desperate longing onto a simple act of shared survival? The silence I had once craved was now my tormentor. It was an empty, echoing void filled with the ghost of his presence. Every creak of the house was a reminder that he wasn't there. The space in the armchair where he had sat felt impossibly vast. The cabin, my sanctuary, had become a prison of my own regret. I spent the day in a fog of self-recrimination. I replayed every moment of the night before, dissecting every word, every look, every touch. I was a fool. I had let my guard down, allowed myself a moment of hope, and this was the price. A brutal, silent rejection. The confirmation of my deepest fear, that I was not enough. That to be truly seen was to be found wanting. I told myself it was for the best. Life could go back to normal, back to my routines, back to the safety of my emotional fortress. But the walls felt different now. They weren't protective, they were just empty. The solitude I had cultivated so carefully was no longer a comfort. It was just loneliness, sharp and agonizing. It was the absence of Cole. A day passed. The town plow finally made it up the mountain, clearing the main road. I saw his truck drive by. My heart leaped into my throat, a wild, stupid hope flaring to life. He was coming back. He was going to explain. He didn't even slow down. I watched his tail lights disappear around the bend, and the hope died, turning to ash in my mouth. That was it then, the final word, a drive-by confirmation of his regret. A second day bled into a second night. I didn't write. I didn't read. I just sat, staring out the window at the snow-covered world, feeling as frozen and lifeless as the landscape. The silence was a physical weight, pressing down on me, crushing the air from my lungs. I was back in my fortress, but this time I was the prisoner, and the ghost of a single kiss was my jailer. I had convinced myself that I was better off alone. That emotional risk was a fool's game with a guaranteed outcome of pain. And the universe, it seemed, had just handed me a brutal, irrefutable piece of evidence to support my case. On the third night, I was huddled by the fire, nursing a cup of tea, trying to pretend that my heart wasn't a shattered mess in my chest. I had decided I would break the lease. I would go back to the city, back to the anonymous noise. I couldn't stay here. Every pine tree, every patch of snow was a monument to my own stupidity. Then a sound, a heavy crunch of boots on snow. My head snapped up. My blood ran cold. It couldn't be. I was imagining it, hallucinating from a potent cocktail of misery and caffeine. Another crunch, closer this time, and then a knock on the door. Soft, hesitant. I didn't move. I couldn't breathe. My heart was a frantic drum against the sudden, roaring silence in my ears. It was him. It had to be him. The knock came again, a little more insistent this time. Slowly, like an old man, I got to my feet. My legs felt unsteady. Every step to the door was a battle. My hand hovered over the doorknob, trembling. What if I was wrong? What if it was just a neighbor? What if it was him, and he was just here to return a borrowed tool, his face a mask of polite indifference? I wasn't sure which would be worse. I took a deep breath and opened the door. It was Cole. He stood on my porch, illuminated by the single yellow bulb. He looked terrible. There were dark circles under his eyes and a new tension in the set of his jaw. He wasn't wearing his heavy work jacket, just a flannel shirt, and he was shivering slightly in the cold night air. He was holding a brown paper bag of groceries, and he clutched it like a shield. We just stood there for a long moment, the cold air swirling between us. He wouldn't meet my eyes. He just stared at a spot somewhere over my shoulder. He started, his voice rough. I was in town. I figured you might be low on supplies. It was a flimsy excuse. A pathetic, transparent reason for being here. My own voice, when it came, was brittle. I'm fine. The words were a wall. A pathetic defense against the hope that was threatening to break through my carefully constructed misery. He flinched just slightly. Right? He said, finally looking at me. His eyes were filled with a raw, miserable emotion that mirrored my own. Okay, well, I'll just leave these here for you. He started to turn away, and something inside me snapped. The fear, the hurt, the 3 days of agonizing silence, it all boiled over. Why did you run? The question stopped him cold. He froze, his back still to me. Cole, I said, my voice shaking now. Why did you just leave? He turned back around slowly. The confident, capable man was gone. In his place was someone who looked lost. Scared. I panicked, he whispered, the words barely audible. I woke up, and it was all so real. And I panicked. I took a step forward, out into the cold. You panicked, so you left? Without a word? For 3 days? Did you think I wouldn't notice? The sarcasm was a bitter taste in my mouth, a weak shield for the raw hurt underneath. I'm not good at this, he said, his voice pleading. He gestured vaguely between us. This? Talking. Feelings. I don't know how. My whole life, when things get complicated, I just work harder. Or I leave. It's all I know how to do. He took a step closer, his eyes searching mine. I drove past your cabin a dozen times. I couldn't make myself stop. I kept thinking, what if I imagined it? What if it was just the storm? What if I come to the door and you look at me like I'm crazy? His fear was a mirror of my own. All my anxieties, all my self-doubt, reflected back at me from his eyes. He wasn't rejecting me. He was just as terrified as I was. I didn't imagine it, I said softly. And you're not crazy. These last 3 days, he continued, his voice thick with emotion, they've been hell. The quiet, it was worse than ever. Because I knew what I was missing. I knew what the silence could be. With you, the confession hung in the frigid air, a fragile, beautiful thing. All the anger, all the hurt inside me just dissolved. It evaporated, leaving only a vast, aching tenderness. My place is cold, he said, a desperate edge to his voice. And it's too damn quiet. I came back. I was hoping, can I stay? It wasn't just a question about the night. It was a question about all the nights to come. It was an offering, a plea. He was standing on my doorstep, stripped of all his defenses, showing me the lonely, frightened man he kept hidden from the world. And in that moment, I knew the risk, the fear, the potential for heartbreak. It was all worth it. I stepped aside, holding the door open. Come in, I said. It's warm inside. He walked past me into the cabin, bringing the scent of the cold night with him. He put the bag of groceries on the kitchen counter with a sense of permanence, as if he belonged there. He didn't sit in the armchair. He didn't retreat to the other side of the room. He just stood in the middle of the floor, watching me. I closed the door, shutting out the cold, shutting out the rest of the world. And this time, when the silence settled around us, it wasn't empty. It was full of fear and hope and the terrifying, wonderful possibility of a new beginning. That night, we didn't just share a bed. We shared stories, whispers in the dark, confessions of past hurts, and foolish dreams. He told me about the bad breakup that had sent him running to the mountains. I told him about the crippling social anxiety that had made my world so small. We unwrapped our wounds for each other, laying them bare in the safety of the darkness. His hand found mine under the blankets, his calloused fingers lacing through my own. It was a simple, solid anchor in the dark. There was no morning after anxiety this time. I woke to the smell of coffee. Real coffee. Cole was in my kitchen, moving with a quiet competence that was no longer intimidating, but deeply comforting. He was wearing a pair of my sweatpants, which were comically short on him, and one of my old t-shirts. He looked ridiculous and utterly, breathtakingly perfect. He handed me a mug, his fingers brushing against mine. The casual touch sent a familiar jolt through me, but this time it wasn't laced with panic. It was warm. It was right. "Morning," he murmured, his voice still rough with sleep. "Morning," I replied, a slow smile spreading across my face. And just like that, a new routine began. A routine for two. The days that followed were a quiet revelation. We learned the rhythms of each other's lives. I learned that he hummed a low, tuneless sound when he was fixing things. He learned that I paced when I was trying to untangle a difficult sentence. We discovered the small, mundane details that form the true architecture of a life. He hated cilantro. I couldn't sleep without the window cracked open, even in the winter. Our silences became our language. We could sit for hours in the same room, him oiling a piece of leather for a tool and me typing away on my laptop, and the quiet was a comfortable, shared blanket. It was no longer an absence of sound, but a presence. It was the sound of him breathing, the gentle tap of my keys, the sigh of the wind in the pines outside. It was the sound of peace. One afternoon, he was fixing the perpetually dripping faucet in the bathroom. I was reading my latest chapter aloud, a habit I had to see if the dialogue sounded natural. He came and leaned in the doorway, wiping his hands on a rag, and just listened. When I finished, he was quiet for a moment. "That guy," he said, nodding toward my laptop. "The quiet one. He's got a lot going on in his head, huh?" I laughed. "You have no idea." "Yeah, I do," he said, and his eyes were so full of understanding it made my chest ache. "I think I do." He never officially moved in. His things just started appearing. A toothbrush in the holder next to mine. A pair of worn work boots by the door. His ridiculously large coffee mug in the dish drainer. The cabin, my fortress of solitude, slowly, organically, became our home. I look back on the man I was before the storm, that lonely, fearful person hiding behind a window, and I barely recognize him. I came to these mountains seeking isolation as a shield. I believed that love was a risk I couldn't afford, that connection was a prelude to pain. I was so determined to protect myself from the world that I was slowly, quietly suffocating. Cole wasn't an interruption to my carefully curated life. He was a blizzard, a force of nature that tore down my walls and forced me out into the cold, terrifying, beautiful light. He was the plot twist I never saw coming, the one that made the whole story make sense. Now, the silence I share with him is my favorite sound. It's the quiet comfort of a hand in mine as we watch the sunset paint the snow-covered peaks. It's the gentle rhythm of his breathing next to me in the dark. It's the unspoken understanding that passes between us in a single glance across a room. I came here to be alone, and in the heart of a storm, in the arms of a man I thought was my opposite, I found the one thing I was truly missing. I found my home.